Welcome to POTUS 2017, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and constitutional lawyer Glenn Greenwald. He says the bipartisan applause for the president's missile attack on Syria is capitulation to an omnipotent presidency that began way before Donald Trump. And in our evidence-based politics segment, we'll turn from the Eastern Mediterranean to other troubled waters where the Navy is displaying American power, the seas near North Korea. But to begin, the changed presidency after the missile attacks. Most people first heard the name Glenn Greenwald in 2013 after his astonishing series of reports in the Guardian newspaper based on classified documents disclosed by Edward Snowden. Those stories revealed that the National Security Agency was gathering data from all foreign and domestic phone calls. Greenwald now co-edits and writes for The Intercept. He's penned many books, but his first feels newly relevant this week. It's titled, How Would a Patriot Act? Defending American Values from a President Run Amok. Glenn Greenwald lives in Brazil and joins us via Skype now from Rio de Janeiro. Glenn, thanks so much for doing this. Hello from New York.
Great to be with you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
That reference in your earlier book to a president run amok was to George W. Bush, but is Trump now doing a similar thing with respect to the Constitution and war powers?
He's certainly trying. I think probably the most single disturbing aspect of his presidency thus far was the attempt to ban all immigrants from 7 predominantly Muslim countries, which he made clear both during the campaign and since the inauguration, was really about banning people who ascribe to a certain religion, about as antithetical to American values as it can get. But there has been, I think, a much more encouraging response under the Trump presidency than there was in the post-9/11 climate of the Bush presidency, which is you see courts and the media and the citizenry and even to some small extent Congress doing its job of checking and imposing limits on the president in a way that never really happened with the Bush presidency. And so I think while the threat might be as extreme or even more extreme, the responses seem to be more encouraging.
But what about Congress's apparently tepid response to war powers and this missile attack compared to the Republican Congress trying to check President Obama and, you know, Mitch McConnell, to take a very primary example, who basically said he wouldn't allow Obama to strike Syria back in 2013 without congressional approval, now taking the opposite position with respect to Trump?
The Republicans are being the most craven partisan hypocrites possible when it comes to the question of striking Assad. As you correctly said, Republicans, not just at the leadership level, but at the grassroots level, were overwhelmingly opposed to this idea when Obama proposed it in 2013, and now are overwhelmingly in favor. There was a poll that showed they went from 39% in favor under Obama to something like 85% or even more this week, now that Trump has actually done it. But I think that the broader point is actually important, which is that the reality is that Congress doesn't want the war powers that the Constitution assigns to it. They've been very content to abdicate this responsibility and allow presidents to decide who gets bombed and for what reasons. And the reality is, even in 2013, President Obama took the position that he didn't need Congress to bomb Assad, and mostly asked them to vote simply as a way of kind of roping them into taking a position so that they couldn't blame him for not bombing Assad if they voted against it. In Libya, Obama did bomb and got involved in the war there, even after Congress rejected its authorization. So you've seen this kind of growing imperial presidency over decades that Trump, unfortunately, is now able to exploit.
By the way, viewers, if Glenn Greenwald is appearing a little bit dark on your screen, we'll let you in on the behind-the-scenes weather conditions. There's a storm in Rio, and some of the lights have gone out. So we're doing the best we can. And thanks for putting up with it, Glenn, and doing the interview anyway. This attack on Assad flips the narrative with respect to Trump. He had called Assad an animal after this attack, but this came just days after reasserting the sort of America First nationalist position that Assad wasn't worth our time or money or blood because he doesn't threaten America directly. What do you make of the flip?
It's a really stunning turnaround. I mean, during the 18 months that he was running for president, he continually embraced this kind of Charles Lindbergh, Pat Buchanan, America First view of the world, that we ought to get along with even the worst dictators, even if they engage in genocide or war crimes, as long as they're not threatening the U.S. He specifically said that we have no business enforcing what Assad does in Syria, that we ought to be working with Assad to fight al-Qaeda and ISIS. And he essentially introduced this broad-scale attack on the kind of neocon, neoliberal vision of foreign policy that says that America ought to engage in military action to uphold international values or to punish bad dictators. He said this over and over and over, and a lot of people who voted for him thought he believed it. They thought that we were going to stop spending money on foreign interventions and instead spend it on Americans. And so to see him less than 3 months in office turn around and not just violate this philosophy, but this specific case of Assad, where he said over and over, we have no interest in what Assad does to Syrians, to suddenly now shoot a few dozen Tomahawk missiles at Assad, is a really remarkable turnaround. I think it illustrates what a lot of people said was his greatest danger, which is the unhinged, unmoored instability of this man who has no real philosophy or fixed belief system and can at any moment change his mind about anything with the slightest provocation.
What's your dog's name, by the way?
He's very excited by this whole discussion.
Just acknowledging the presence of the dog so that the viewers don't think this is happening outside their window or they're going crazy. Do you buy the prevailing narrative in the U.S. media that Trump genuinely got horrified by the videos of the babies choking and suffocating on what appeared to be sarin gas or something like it, and turned on a dime his entire foreign policy with respect to Assad on that basis?
Of course not. It's completely implausible for so many reasons, beginning with the fact that this is the same Donald Trump who mercilessly shut the doors of America's immigration policy to these very same Syrian children who are fleeing Assad, who said that none of them are permitted to come here. The Syrians were included in the Muslim ban or the immigration ban that President Trump ordered. So why would somebody feel this great humanitarian empathy for Syrians who are being gassed, but at the same time refuse to do the one thing that could actually help them, which is to allow them to emigrate to the United States and seek asylum and refuge here? On top of which, in the last 2 months, President Trump has killed huge numbers of civilians in multiple countries, including Syria. They bombed a mosque near Aleppo. They have killed hundreds of civilians in Mosul in Iraq. They ordered a commando raid in Yemen that massacred dozens of people, including children. And he expressed no remorse about any of this whatsoever. In fact, vowed during the campaign that they would murder the families of terrorists, that they would liberate the American military from rules of engagement designed to avoid civilian deaths. So,
and I'll throw in another one. There were reports just the other day that there was a specific decision to loosen the rules of engagement for U.S. bombing in Somalia or special forces attacks in Somalia, specifically with respect to how many civilian casualties we're willing to endure or cause in order to get to the terrorists we're trying to get to. So the rules were loosening with respect to U.S.-caused civilian casualties, and then he turns around and says this. But then what's the alternative explanation?
I mean, I think that there's an assumption that Trump operates the way other presidents do or other national political figures operate, which is that there's some kind of rational calculus or true motive that explains his actions. And I think that that's an assumption that's probably unwarranted. There are stories, for example, that his daughter Ivanka, with whom he's very close and whose input he seems really to value, was emotionally moved by these photos of Syrian children and prevailed upon him to take action in response. There are other theories that there was a political benefit for him to get and that it distracted attention away from the difficulties he had, from the obsession with Russia, that it let him prove that he's not a puppet of the Kremlin or Putin by attacking one of Putin's closest allies in the world. So I don't think we can know the motive for sure, but there's a lot of other motives that seem to me more persuasive than Donald Trump suddenly developed a conscience for foreign children and the harms that they endure in war.
Given your familiarity with the NSA and other kinds of surveillance and things like that through your work with Edward Snowden, et cetera, what do you make of the recent development that Trump foreign policy aide during the campaign, Carter Page, was reportedly, according to the Washington Post, surveilled, that the FBI got the FISA court to approve surveillance of Carter Page as a possible foreign agent?
So I think that, first of all, we need to understand that the FISA process is a very empty and symbolic process. Over the past 15 years, the FISA court has rejected a tiny handful of warrant requests that have been submitted by the NSA or related agencies. So it's very easy to get a FISA warrant on somebody. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. At the same time, the intelligence community does not willy-nilly go and ask for a FISA warrant where they have to make the allegation that somebody is an agent of a foreign power, especially when that person is connected in some way to the Trump campaign. How connected Carter Page really is, I think, is an open question. I don't think he was a senior operative or anything like that. I think he latched on to the campaign. But whenever you have somebody who a court finds probable cause to believe is an agent of a foreign power and issues a warrant to eavesdrop on them in the middle of a campaign, it's very significant. I just don't think that this is the kind of fire that Democrats are looking for, at least a lot of Democrats are looking for. I think a lot more is needed than Carter Page to get to the highest levels of the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency when it comes to trying to tie them to Russia.
At the joint news conference just a short time ago with Tillerson and his Russian counterpart Lavrov in Moscow, Tillerson would not say he showed evidence to Russia about election hacking. And I guess you can take that as a lack of evidence, or you can take it as a continuation of covering up collusion, not to bring anything into the open. Do you take it as one or the other?
I'm trying to look at all these questions as much as possible strictly as a journalist, which means that I want to see evidence for claims being made by the government before we believe them to be true. And it is true that all 17 intelligence agencies have endorsed with varying degrees of confidence the theory that the Russians interfered in the election by hacking John Podesta and the DNC's email with the intention of electing Donald Trump. But to date, the government has presented no evidence at all of this, which doesn't mean we should believe it's false, but I think it should preclude us from believing that it's true without seeing that evidence. On the question of collusion, James Clapper, Obama's senior national security official, told Chuck Todd on Meet the Press just a couple of weeks ago that at least until he left office, which was only January 20th, just maybe 10 weeks ago, he had never seen evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians on the question of this hacking. And I never really have understood why the Russians would need to collude with Trump in order to do it. They could just do it, release it through WikiLeaks if that were really their goal. And I think that unless there's evidence of high-level collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian government in order to hack into the DNC or Podesta to swing the election, I don't think it's going to deliver impeachment or anything close to that. And thus far, we haven't seen any evidence. It doesn't mean I think it didn't happen or that it's implausible, but I think we ought to demand evidence for it first.
Tillerson also at the news conference did not cite evidence of Assad unleashing the chemical weapons, though he asserted that that evidence exists beyond a reasonable doubt. The Guardian, your old paper, has published what it says is evidence, if nothing else, the timeline of Syrian warplanes attacking that particular rebel-held city, and then the symptoms of a gas attack showing up in people and the autopsies performed at Turkish hospitals. Are you skeptical?
I think anytime there are claims made in the context of war, we have to be skeptical. I mean, unfortunately, one of the lessons we learned, obviously, from Iraq, but even if you go back to Vietnam with the Gulf of Tonkin, lies that were told to justify that resolution, governments lie constantly in war. And when you add to that the fog of war, the difficulty of finding out what really happened when people are shooting at one another, in Syria, it's incredibly complex. It's very hard to know for sure. I do think the Assad government has used chemical weapons in the past. They clearly have killed their own citizens in a very indiscriminate way. I think there's a lot of evidence about that. And there is some actual concrete evidence that they did use chemical weapons here, but it's not definitive. And I think skepticism has to always be the overarching mentality that we use when assessing claims by the government in the context of war.
Therefore, because I think you have an interest in as little use of the military in general by anybody as possible, the U.S. should have waited, in your opinion, for a UN investigation or something like it to determine more definitively whether it was Assad?
I think even if you assume that Assad used chemical weapons in this case, and again, I believe he has used chemical weapons in the past against Syrians, there's still a question of whether or not we should want the U.S., particularly unilaterally, to just launch a bunch of Tomahawk missiles at Syria. The reason why this resonates is because we feel like there's a humanitarian imperative here to stop a dictator from using chemical weapons against his own people. But do we really believe that the United States military is going to blow things up for humanitarian ends? Even if they want to, do we think they're capable of that? And do we really believe that when their commander-in-chief is Donald Trump, that this is going to be a humanitarian mission? I think, you can look at what's happening in Syria and find it appalling, as every decent person does, but there's a huge leap from that to saying, I think the solution, the way to help Syrians, is by allowing Donald Trump unilaterally to shoot a bunch of missiles at them. And I don't find it at all persuasive that we're going to help the situation in Syria at all. We very well may make it worse, even if we have the best of intentions.
We just have under a minute left. Can I ask you very briefly if you know if Edward Snowden is still in Russia, and if you think the prospects of his coming home to the United States are any different under Trump than they were under Obama?
I do know that he's still in Russia. He actually just had his residency rights extended for another 3 years back in February. There's some campaigns being waged within the intelligence community to get Trump to try and induce Putin to hand Snowden over as kind of a gift to Trump as part of a broader agreement between the two countries. But I think the tensions recently between the U.S. and Russia, as alluded to you in previous questions, make it less likely than ever, in fact, that will in fact happen.
Glenn Greenwald from the Intercept, thank you very much. I'm glad the dogs stopped barking. I hope that means the weather is clearing up and the lights will come back on soon.
Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate it.
And viewers, stay tuned as we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. President Trump's willingness to launch missiles into Syria is raising the level of anxiety in South Korea. Reportedly, citizens fear Trump might also launch a preemptive strike against nuclear-armed North Korea, which has been testing missiles lately. Adding to the fears are Trump's redeployment of warships near the Korean peninsula and this presidential tweet, which says that North Korea is looking for trouble, and if the Chinese don't solve it, the USA will. Could this saber-rattling turn into a bloody fight, even a nuclear one? Joining us, David Kang. He directs the Korean Studies Institute and Center for International Studies at the University of Southern California. Kang is author of the upcoming book, Arms Races, American Grand Strategy and Enduring East Asian Stability in the 21st Century. He joins us on Skype from Los Angeles. Professor, thanks for doing this. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I see that your historical analysis suggests that deterrence has held for 70 years between the two Koreas because both sides believe the other. What is it that they need to believe to keep the peace?
You know, unfortunately, what they need to believe is that the other side will fire back. And that's exactly what both countries have been showing with all of the muscle flexing and missile launches and everything else, that we still believe that North Korea will respond if attacked. And that's why we don't attack.
So your history suggests that when we strike North Korea, they do strike back. Are there some examples of that have already taken place?
Unfortunately, this occurs on a regular basis. Probably the most recent one is the sinking of the South Korean naval vessel, the Cheonan, in 2010. 46 South Korean sailors were killed, and we usually view that as an unprovoked North Korean attack. But what is often forgotten is that 4 months earlier, in November 2009, a South Korean naval ship shot up a North Korean naval ship. North Korea publicly said, "You will pay a dear price," and 4 months later, South Korea did. So that's the kind of thing where, you know, if we're not paying attention, yes, things can get out of hand, but both sides make very clear that they're willing to fight back.
So you conclude that American presidents in the past have concluded that it's not worth starting a war with North Korea, no matter how bad a regime it seems to be, because they decided the costs were not worth the benefits?
Absolutely. And I mean, and that's part of every president comes in, every American president comes in saying, we've got to do something about North Korea. Let's look at all the options, just like Trump has done. But they all conclude that the costs of fighting a war and potentially having Seoul destroyed, who knows how many tens of thousands of casualties, just isn't enough and just isn't worth it. So almost every president begins to say, all right, we have to find some other solution.
Reports were that President Obama told Trump during the transition that North Korea could be the worst problem he would face in the near term on foreign policy. How much does it make sense to you that Obama would have drawn that conclusion when there is ISIS and the mass refugee problem from Syria and other things?
Well, and that's exactly one of the issues. As bad as what's going on in the Middle East is, Syria doesn't really have the chance to directly threaten numerous cities in the United States with nuclear annihilation. North Korea can't do that yet, but they're on the path to it. So in many ways, ISIS, horrific. Refugees, Syria, horrific. But those can't challenge American survival the way that North Korea potentially could.
I could look at North Korea and say they make a lot of noise, including missile tests as noise, but they don't actually plan to attack any other country because of the credibility that you cited at the beginning of our conversation, that they know if they really were to attack South Korea or Japan or the United States, that would be suicide for their regime.
Well, and that's exactly one reason that this endless cycle of we send B-2 bombers and aircraft carriers, we shake our fists. North Korea believes us that we will wipe them out if they attack first. So they're deterred. They then shake their fist at us and say, if you strike us first, we'll take you out. And the thing is, we believe them. So deterrence holds. But it's, you know, the tragedy is that we're in the same place. And deterrence is not a solution to the issue. Deterrence just freezes things in place in the status quo.
Do you have any reason to believe Trump will break this pattern of restraint and actually attack?
Not really. I mean, it's easy to talk tough. You know, presidential tweets, rhetoric, all of those things are ways that we send information or signals to North Korea. But it's very different launching a couple missiles against Syria when they can't respond, and then launching a couple missiles at North Korea where they can take out our allies. So right now, I don't have any reason to think that Trump would do something as risky as that. I mean, that is an enormous risk that we take.
So the new deployment of the U.S. warship Carl Vinson to the region, how historically unique is that in the 70 years of North Korea's existence?
Not that unique. It happens with great regularity. We regularly send our warships, our B-2 bombers that take off in the United States, refuel over the Pacific, do a practice bombing run over the peninsula, and turn around and go home. I mean, we do this stuff on an annual basis. So it looks bad right now, but unless something dramatically unexpected happens, it's mostly our way of shaking our fist at the North Koreans.
In fact, at his news conference in Moscow, and I don't know if you've even seen this yet because it's so new, Secretary of State Tillerson downplayed that deployment and basically called it routine. That would be the opposite of describing it as a warning to North Korea, which is how it's been portrayed in the press. And I don't know if administration officials had portrayed it that way previously. What do you make of it?
I hadn't heard that, but it strikes me as the proper tone. In some ways, it's still reminding, even if it's routine, it reminds North Korea how powerful the United States is. But it also stops all of this talk about impending war, when the reality is the situation is stable. Again, it is not a good status quo, but it is a status quo. And so I think Tillerson made the right type of comments.
So how do we break this cycle of saber rattling on one side and saber rattling on the other, which risks one leader or another making a false move and starting an actual war, even a nuclear war? I see you have an economic angle.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, and that's the thing, even though the deterrence has been very stable, there is a chance for misperception. There's always a chance that one leader will decide, this time I'll take a chance. But as you point out, one of the things that we tend to overlook if we only look at North Korea's security is that their economy is more penetrated and more open now than it's ever been. And although it's not a completely open market economy, much has changed in the business sector. People are no longer just simply going to a ration system with a communist, centrally planned economy. And those types of changes are consequential for the way North Koreans interact with their government. In some ways, I actually think we should be encouraging more market activity in North Korea. We should be encouraging more cross-border trade. That's how people change their minds, and that's the way that we can change North Korea.
This is the China theory, the Cuba theory of U.S. relations.
Absolutely, right? Many countries aren't exactly wonderful, nice countries, but we have much better relations with them today than we did 30 years ago, and I think China is a great example of that.
Professor Kang, thank you so much. And that's POTUS 2017 for today. We're here each week at this hour, keeping watch on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching. I'll be back next week. As for Bill O'Reilly, we'll see.